Science fiction has a problem, not a science problem, a writing problem. Whenever a movie starts throwing around words like quantum mechanics, wormholes, anti-million-dollar equations, or astrophysics, there's always this moment where I subconsciously prepare myself to be confused. I almost expect the film to pause the story, hand me a textbook, and hope I can keep up. And to be fair, sometimes that's part of the appeal. Take Interstellar, for example. I genuinely love that film. It's one of my all-time favorites, and seeing it in theater was one of the greatest cinematic experiences I've ever had. But let's be honest, understanding Interstellar isn't exactly a one-time experience. I watched it once because I loved it. I watched it again because I had questions. I watched it a third time because I still had questions. And eventually, after countless rewatches, diagrams, interviews, and YouTube explanations, everything finally clicked. Now that's not necessarily a criticism. Christopher Nolan intentionally builds puzzles. His films invite multiple viewings, and that's part of their identity. But it raises an interesting question. Does a science fiction movie have to confuse you in order to feel intelligent? Project Hail Mary answers that question with a very confident no, because this film does something surprisingly rare.
I cannot do this.
You're smart. You'll figure it out.
It explains incredibly complex scientific concepts, while making you feel smart instead of making you feel lost. And that isn't because the science is simplified. It's because the screenplay understands something that so many science fiction films forget. The audience doesn't need simpler science. They need better storytelling. That's a huge difference. The film opens with one of my favorite screenplay decisions of the year. Instead of beginning on Earth and slowly building towards space, we're immediately dropped into the middle of the mystery. Ryland Grace, played by Ryan Gosling, wakes up aboard a spaceship. He's alone. He doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know why he's there. And perhaps most importantly, neither do we. His memory is gone. The audience shares his confusion. So immediately, the film creates two different stories running simultaneously. One exists in the present. Grace is stranded in space, trying to survive while slowly recovering fragments of his memory. The other exists in the past. Every recovered memory answers another question. Who is Grace? Why was he chosen? What happened to Earth? What mission is he actually on? At first glance, this feels like a classic mystery structure. But I don't think that's why the writers chose it. Because if the goal were simply to explain the mission, they could have started on Earth, chronologically like almost every other disaster movie. Instead, they deliberately create two timelines, and that decision ends up solving multiple storytelling problems at once. The present timeline constantly creates questions. The past timeline rewards us with answers. The audience never feels like they're sitting through exposition. They're uncovering a mystery, and that makes learning feel exciting. But here's where I think the screenplay becomes genuinely brilliant, because the biggest obstacle still hasn't arrived. Eventually, this movie has to explain one of the most complicated scientific ideas in its entire plot. The mysterious Petrova line, a phenomenon that's slowly dimming the sun, a discovery that could eventually freeze the Earth into a global ice age. This is exactly where most science fiction films stumble. They stop telling a story and start giving a lecture. Project Hail Mary finds a much smarter solution, and it's one that every screenwriter should study, because it turns one of Hollywood's oldest writing problems into one of the film's greatest strengths. One of the hardest things any science fiction movie has to do is explain its science, not because the science itself is complicated, but because exposition is one of the fastest ways to kill momentum. We've all seen it before. A room full of scientists throwing around technical terms while one character conveniently asks questions the audience would ask. The information gets delivered, but it rarely feels natural. Project Hail Mary finds a much smarter solution. Instead of asking, how do we explain astrophysics? It asks a completely different question. Who would naturally explain this to someone who knows nothing? The answer, a science teacher. Before Ryland Grace ever becomes humanity's last hope, he's standing in front of a classroom filled with children. That tiny character detail changes everything, because now, every complicated scientific idea has a believable reason to be simplified. Grace isn't dumbing science down for the audience. He's doing exactly what his job has trained him to do: teach. And that's a massive difference. Good exposition never feels like exposition. It feels like character. When the Petrova line is discovered, the movie has to explain an almost impossible concept. A strange, astronomical phenomenon. Something that appears across the sun something that shouldn't exist, something capable of threatening every living thing on Earth. If another screenplay handled this, we'd probably get a conference room presentation, graphs, PowerPoint slides, scientists interrupting each other with increasingly complicated vocabulary. Instead, Project Hail Mary cuts to Grace in a classroom. He grabs simple objects, draws on a board, uses analogies. He's explaining the biggest scientific discovery in human history, exactly the same way he'd explain gravity to a 10-year-old. And somehow, it never feels like the movie is talking to us. It feels like we're watching a genuinely gifted teacher doing what he loves. That's because the explanation isn't separated from the character. It reveals who Grace is. The movie isn't pausing to deliver information. It's building its protagonist. That's something the screenplay understands remarkably well. Information is always easier to remember when it's attached to emotion. You probably don't remember every equation your teachers wrote on the board, but you remember the teachers who made difficult ideas feel exciting. Grace is that kind of teacher. He doesn't just explain science. He makes people want to understand it. And because we see that side of him first, every scientific conversation later in the film feels earned. When Grace starts solving impossible problems aboard the ship, we already believe him. Not because the screenplay told us he's brilliant, because it showed us how his brain works. The classroom scenes quietly established something else too. Grace wasn't chosen because he's the smartest scientist on Earth. He's chosen because he's uniquely capable of communicating ideas. That's a subtle distinction. Knowledge and teaching aren't the same skill. There are plenty of geniuses who struggle to explain even simple concepts. Grace does the opposite. He makes impossible concepts feel approachable. That ability becomes one of his greatest strengths throughout the story. Because survival isn't just about solving problems, it's about understanding them, and helping someone else understand them too, which becomes incredibly important once another character enters the story. A character who doesn't speak English, doesn't look human, doesn't even experience the universe the same way we do. Before Project Hail Mary becomes a story about saving humanity. It quietly becomes a story about two minds learning how to understand each other. And that's where the movie becomes far more than just another science fiction adventure. Up until this point, Project Hail Mary has been telling two stories at once. One is about solving an impossible scientific mystery. The other is about a man slowly discovering who he really is. Because the Ryland Grace we meet at the beginning isn't the same Ryland Grace we meet by the end. And the screenplay makes sure that transformation isn't told to us. It's revealed piece by piece through the flashbacks. When Earth realizes the Petrova line is threatening the sun, the mission becomes obvious. Someone has to leave the solar system, find the source, and somehow save humanity. It's the kind of mission every Hollywood hero immediately volunteers for. Grace doesn't. In fact, he refuses, repeatedly. He's terrified, not of failure, of dying. It's an uncomfortable moment because it strips away the fantasy we've grown used to. Most blockbuster protagonists are fearless because the audience expects them to be. Grace reacts the way most real people probably would. He's a teacher, not a soldier, not an astronaut chasing glory, just someone who suddenly discovers the world expects him to sacrifice everything, and he can't do it. Some viewers dislike this version of Grace. They wanted someone more traditionally heroic, but that's exactly why it works. Heroes who begin perfect have nowhere to go. Heroes who begin broken have somewhere to grow.
This might be very hard for you to understand, but some people are failures. Some people don't rise to the challenge.
You've been present for every major scientific or strategic meeting we've had on the mission.
The film even makes this painfully clear through Eva Stratt. She's one of the most fascinating characters in the movie because she represents ruthless pragmatism. While everyone else debates ethics, politics, and public opinion, Stratt only asks one question. What gives humanity the highest chance of survival? Nothing else matters. Not popularity, not feelings, not even consent. It's why one of the film's most controversial moments happens when Grace realizes the truth. He never actually chose this mission. He was forced onto it. It's shocking. And honestly, it should be. Because the movie refuses to pretend that saving humanity comes with clean moral choices. Every option is terrible. Stratt simply chooses the least terrible one. Whether you agree with her or not, the screenplay refuses to give you an easy answer. But here's the brilliant part. Grace begins the mission as someone who has nothing worth dying for. No family waiting at home, no great purpose, no dream larger than himself. He's surviving because he has to, not because he wants to. Then everything changes, not because of another human, because of an alien. When Rocky appears, the movie quietly shifts genres. The mystery remains, the science remains. But underneath all of it, Project Hail Mary becomes a friendship story. And somehow, it ends up being the emotional heart of the entire film. On paper, it sounds ridiculous. A lonely human stranded in space becomes best friends with a giant rock-like alien. That shouldn't work. In most movies, it probably wouldn't. But Rocky isn't written as a gimmick. He's written as a person. Or more accurately, as someone whose personality feels unmistakably real. He's brilliant, curious, funny without trying to be funny, stubborn, loyal, just different enough to feel truly alien, but similar enough that genuine friendship becomes believable. The first conversations between Grace and Rocky aren't about saving the universe. They're about understanding each other, learning words, sharing ideas, making mistakes, laughing at misunderstandings. The screenplay slows down. It allows the relationship to grow instead of rushing to the next action sequence, because it understands something many science fiction films forget. Audiences don't fall in love with ideas, they fall in love with relationships. And before long, solving astrophysics becomes less interesting than simply watching these two characters spend time together. That's when you realize the mission may have started as humanity's survival story, but it's quietly becoming something much more personal. That friendship is ultimately what transforms Ryland Grace, not his mission, not humanity. Rocky. At the beginning of the film, Grace can't bring himself to die for billions of strangers. By the end, he's willing to risk everything for one friend. It's a beautiful inversion of the classic hero's journey. Most stories try to make their protagonist fall in love with humanity. Project Hail Mary does something much smaller, and somehow much more believable. It gives Grace one person to care about. Because that's how people usually change. Not through speeches, not through destiny, through relationships. Every problem Grace and Rocky solve together strengthens that bond. They exchange knowledge. They build technology neither species could have created alone. They save each other's lives more than once. And without ever saying it directly, the film keeps asking the same question. What happens when someone who is afraid to sacrifice himself finally finds something worth sacrificing for? By the final act, we have the answer. Grace discovers that returning home means abandoning Rocky to almost certain death. For a brief moment, the old Grace has an escape. He can complete the mission, return to Earth as a hero, survive. It's exactly what the man from the beginning of the movie would have wanted. Instead, he turns the ship around, not because someone orders him to, not because humanity demands it, because he chooses to. That's the key word, choice. Earlier in the film, Eva Stratt stole that choice from him. Now, for the first time, Grace makes the decision entirely on his own. Ironically, the man who was forced onto the mission becomes the only person truly willing to stay on it. That's one of the most satisfying character arcs in recent science fiction. The external goal never changes, save humanity. But the internal motivation changes completely. Grace doesn't become brave because fear disappears. He becomes brave because someone else matters more than his fear. That emotional payoff lands because the screenplay has earned it. Although, there's one part of the movie that doesn't feel quite as convincing. The communication between Grace and Rocky develops incredibly fast. At first, watching two completely different species slowly decode each other's language is fascinating. It's awkward, it's funny, it feels grounded. But then the film accelerates. Within what feels like a surprisingly short amount of time, they're discussing advanced scientific concepts, making jokes, and communicating with remarkable precision. It's still enjoyable, but it also feels like the screenplay quietly skips over one of its biggest challenges. Realistically, building a shared language between two species with different biology, different senses, and completely different ways of thinking should take much longer. Ironically, that's exactly the kind of scientific problem this movie usually loves exploring. Here, it chooses efficiency over realism. And honestly, it's probably the right decision, because spending another 40 minutes on linguistics would have slowed the film to a crawl. Sometimes storytelling isn't about choosing the most realistic option. It's about choosing the one that best serves the emotional journey, even if that means asking the audience for a little extra suspension of disbelief. Besides, by that point, most viewers probably aren't watching because they want to know how translation software works. They're watching because they want Grace and Rocky to succeed. That's a sign the screenplay has already won. The science may have brought us into the story, but the friendship is what keeps us there. And that's exactly why the film's final structural decision is so clever. Project Hail Mary isn't a better movie than Interstellar. Interstellar reaches emotional and philosophical heights that few science fiction films ever have. But where Project Hail Mary truly shines is in its screenplay. It understands that great science fiction isn't about making science more complicated, it's about making it feel human. By turning exposition into character development, using its dual timeline structure to keep the story constantly engaging, and grounding an interstellar adventure in one unforgettable friendship, it solves one of Hollywood's biggest storytelling problems. Sometimes, the smartest screenplay isn't the one that explains the most. It's the one that makes you forget you're being taught at all. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to CineSpectrum, and let me know in the comments. Which sci-fi movie do you think has the smartest screenplay? I'll see you in the next one.